This podcast is part of the Democracy Group.
Welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I am your host, Corey Nathan, and it is an honor to be a part of the Democracy Group, a network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our democracy and how we can work together to fix it. Remember to subscribe or follow and write a review. I've been telling you about that. The reviews are truly what's going to help us get from that top 1.5% of shows globally to the top 1% and beyond. And it's not just a vanity exercise, although it's pretty cool. It's like bringing home a trophy or whatever. But you know, the top 1%'s got enough of those shows with, we always talk about the extremists and the screamers. And it's time for folks like you and me, folks who want more sane, civil, nuanced, and more fun conversations on the important topics. Conversations just like the one we're having today with Alexander Vindman. Alexander Vindman is a retired U.S. Army lieutenant colonel and was the director of European Affairs on the White House's National Security Council. Many listeners will remember Colonel Vindman's testimony before Congress back in 2019 regarding the Trump-Ukraine scandal. But there's so much more to Dr. Vindman's story. He is a recipient of the Purple Heart, having sustained wounds in a 2004 IED attack as an infantry officer serving in Iraq. Alex holds a doctorate in international affairs from Johns Hopkins and a master's in the same field from Harvard. He's a Hauser leader at Harvard, a senior fellow of the Foreign Policy Institute at Johns Hopkins, and the author of the best-selling memoir, Here, Right Matters, as well as the writer of an excellent Substack, I'm now addicted to it, admittedly, called Why It Matters. Speaking of which, I wanted to tell you that thanks to a very useful resource that you shared this morning, I called my Congressman, Mike Garcia, and left him a message. Yeah, all thanks to you and your brother, Eugene. So if just to start, would you mind telling folks what I'm referring to? And if you would, why it matters?
Well, that's awesome. Frankly, I'm very glad you did that. I'm familiar. You're in the LA area, right?
Mm-hmm.
I guess. Yeah, so I'm familiar with that district. We actually vote vets in my organization that I participate in politics through, basically advocating for veteran and national security leaders in elected office, in federal office. We've been involved in that district before, trying to unseat Garcia because he was part of what we call the insurrection caucus. So I'm familiar with where you are generally. But what you're referring to is an initiative I ginned up last night as I was thinking, what can we do to apply some additional pressure on the Republicans? They're recalcitrant. They're really, beholden to the extreme elements of the Republican Party and the de facto leader of the Republican Party, Donald Trump's proclivities for Russia and against Ukraine. And the only thing that really makes sense is engaging with elected office holders, letting constituents reach out and say, this is an important issue. So over the course of this morning, I put together a means for listeners, for readers to click on a simple link, put in their address, and connect with their elected office holder, their congressman, and let them know with a simple script that they are interested in Ukraine and interested in that congressman passing Ukraine funding. And I did that on Substack to my followers. Eugene, who should be by all rights just sending emails to raise funding for his campaign, set that aside so like this he could also reach out to his tens of thousands of supporters. On that basis, I blasted out on Twitter, where I've got some 940,000 followers, and threads and post news, something that I've been involved in every means possible to do what I guess I'm not sure if this is a term, but to do a digital rally.
Oh,
a digital rally.
Yeah.
What I call Secure America Digital Rally, because that's what we're doing. If we support Ukraine, if we support Taiwan and Israel, we're securing America.
Right.
So I wanted to try to see if I could add some virality to this and do a digital rally to get folks to reach out to their congressman and let them know that the expectation is that they pass funding for Ukraine.
So you have such an interesting perspective, an informed perspective from having served in the military, served in the White House, with funding for Ukraine, as with funding for to support Israel, addressing what's happening at the southern border. Republicans in the House, they show they prioritize the chaos over solutions and good governance. So I don't know. I couldn't begin to analyze
Yeah.
why they're doing these things, whether it's 2024 or it's just submitting to Donald Trump. So I'm curious why you believe this is happening, but two, more importantly, are there options that either the executive branch has or perhaps actions the Senate can take to address these issues?
Sure. So I think you mentioned two of the key factors, which is 2024 elections, the view that obstruction is the way to deliver a second term to Trump. The idea that any legislation that passes will be a credit to Joe Biden, and therefore do nothing is the best approach. It's frankly a shockingly bad approach, but this is what they're settled on. And then, of course, I think there is a proclivity for Donald Trump. He has chair led for authoritarians, for Xi Jinping, for Kim Jong Un, who he's called he described as exchanging love letters with, and then Vladimir Putin at the top of that list. And then at the same time, because of the fact that he was caught out uh, engaging in abuse of power and corruption against Ukraine and impeached for that reason, he has a animus towards Ukraine. So these are some of the key elements as to why there's no effort to either pass a border security measure or to pass additional funding for Ukraine. That's really one of the primary reasons. As to what can be done, I think in terms of these kinds of massive appropriations, these kinds of large scale funding bills. Now they're large scale in what the general public would see as large scale, but actually in the big scheme of things, what we did last year for Ukraine funding, security assistance funding, amounted to less than 5%
Mm,
of DoD's defense expenditures.
right.
A tiny and a quarter percent of our GDP as a whole. We're a $27 trillion economy. We provided a quarter of a percent, less than 5% of our defense spending, and bought ourselves added security because Ukraine is wrecking Russia's military, which is aggressive towards the U.S., which is aggressive towards NATO, which is in fact one of the key threats that the Department of Defense arrays against, and spends hundreds of billions, trillions of dollars over the past decade to figure out how to deter and defeat Russia, and the Ukrainians are doing it for pennies on the dollar. So, in order to get these kinds of $60 billion deal, that the only way to do that is Constitution says is that the Congress has to approve it. There are some wheeling and dealing going on. The Senate is now looking to potentially pass a standalone funding our allies bill. So that would be Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan, and then putting it in the Republicans' hands and potentially seeing if they could peel away a small number of Republicans to join Democrats in passing that funding. That is not a high probability event, unfortunately. I think the fact is that the Republicans are just going to close ranks, and I'm really pessimistic about additional aid. But the administration has strings that it could pull. Probably the biggest one in terms of funding is seizing Russia's frozen assets and transferring those assets, those
Mm,
Russian central bank assets that we've had frozen since the very, very beginning of the war, transferring those over to Ukraine to rebuild, to use to arm and defend itself. We have a relatively small portion of those assets. The vast majority of those assets are actually in Europe. But by us taking lead, what I call path leading, we provide cover for the Europeans to do the same. They don't have to worry about being caught out and being their economy as a whole is approaching the size of the U.S. It's nearly 20 billion. But individually, the states themselves that have these assets that would be transferring them are smaller. They don't want to be caught out and then be basically the outliers that the Chinese or other kind of authoritarian regimes respond to. us leading it sends a signal that it's us and Europeans, and together we make up, basically what amounts to almost half of the world's GDP, gross domestic product. And that is a warning to anybody to not screw around. That is a warning that, you do not want to provoke the behemoth that is the European and the US economy, because the blowback would be immense. You would lose all those investments, you would lose trade and things of that nature. So that's one thing we could do. There are smaller policy changes that we could do with regards to how we support Ukraine. Right now, the methodology has been to transfer older gear to Ukraine and then automatically reorder it. So all those dollars that you saw come through last year, almost all those dollars, and the 60 billion that has been requested for this year, the vast majority of that actually stays in the U.S. It goes to U.S. defense firms to put the newest and best equipment to our soldiers so they're better equipped to defend the country. That is not an investment in Ukraine. That is an investment in the U.S.
Right.
But that one for one, give something to Ukraine and then replenish it, is why we need that chunk of change. We need the Congress to approve it. In reality, we could break that. We could separate them. We could start giving things to Ukraine, and then later on say, Congress, do you really want to leave the cupboards bare for our military, or are you going to appropriate funds? And no sane Republican, even as radical as they are, would be caught out again, not supporting, providing the proper weaponry to the U.S. military. So that's really a critical step, because there was a law that was passed at the beginning of the war called Lend-Lease, where you could start giving away things to Ukraine legally, and really they don't have to pay that hardly anything for it, but we help them sustain the war effort. Breaking those two up is important. Logistics. I've talked about this, beat my head against the wall about the fact that we are not supporting Ukraine sufficiently from logistics. We've sent a bunch of equipment to Ukraine. We did not provide repair ports for it. We did not provide trained technicians to do it. We could do better there. Training. Last thing I'll mention is training. We trained the Ukrainian soldiers to do basics: shoot, move, communicate. We did not train them for modern warfare on the scale and the complexity that they are experiencing. We need to retrain the commands and the staffs to do this much more effectively. And if we do these things, those are policy changes. Those don't require money. The administration could really take leaps forward in being a better ally and better supporting Ukraine. And then, of course, put pressure on Congress to pass this appropriation. It's one of the easiest things we could do to better secure the United States.
Before we move on, I wanted to tell you about something else that's important. Money. Specifically your money. In all seriousness, I wanted to tell you about my advisor and my friend, George Meza. George runs Meza Wealth Management. And with George, it's not just about money. It's about helping us manage our present and plan for our future. And unlike a lot of other firms out there, George and I actually have a relationship. He knows me, he knows my family, and I know his wonderful family. I also know his firm and the incredible team he's put together, from his chief investment officer to some of the other great people in his office, like Jessica, their head of operations, that are always there to help me and with all aspects of our portfolio. You see, the thing is, I got a lot going on. I guess we all got a lot going on, and I don't have the time to watch our investments all day, every day. And even if I did, I don't have the experience and expertise that George's team collectively has. So we get the entire Meza Wealth Management team, all their expertise and all their integrity. And again, it's based on George knowing me personally, knowing my goals, and even the kind of risk that's appropriate for me to take, which, by the way, could change from one season to the next. And they're on top of all of that. So if you want George Meza and Meza Wealth Management to be on your team, just visit their website, mezawealth.com. That's MEZA wealth.com, www.mezawealth.com. And that will also be in our show notes, so you can check that. And now, back to our show. So there's a lot there. I'm fascinated by so much of what you just shared with us. One that I want to follow up on is, I'm not using the right term, but the redistribution of frozen assets. I have no interest in what Putin Putin's argument would be about that possibility. It's almost like asking Trump about the Constitution.
Yeah.
I'm not interested. What I would be interested is if there is a friendly ally, one that is dedicated to, the post-World War II peace that we've been able to maintain ever with great fragility, albeit great fragility. I'd be interested in what the pushback against that would be from an ethical, principled ally of ours.
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing that they're concerned about is blowback. They don't want foreign countries seizing, nationalizing the investments that their companies are making in various regions around the world. So that's the biggest thing. They're fearful that this would open up Pandora's box and countries would start to nationalize. I want to again dispel that notion, because in reality, these countries rely on what's called foreign direct investment companies from France investing dollars in someplace in Central Africa or something. They need that money. They would not cut off their nose to spite their face by nationalizing assets. In the case of Russia, Russia has already nationalized tons of different assets. Danin, whatever it was transferred to, like a kind of an oligarch in Chechnya and stuff like that. All these kinds of things have already happened. So Russia's kind of pulled the trigger on that already. In terms of a principled reason, it's there, but I think it's in part a bit of a pretext, or maybe a bit of old think, in that what they want to avoid is undermining long held norms, that you do not go after the sovereign assets of another state that's somehow kind of forbidden. In reality, we've done it. We went after assets in Iraq, in other places around the world. The U.S. has done it in order to balance the budget on what that authoritarian leader owed, based on lawsuits for terrorism, whatever the case might be. We've done this. We've gone down this road before. It hasn't been a bunch of times, but a few times we have. And so this is not therefore like this taboo or ironclad norm that could never be touched. We opened that up before. But I think there is some old think about the fact that we shouldn't do this to states. The problem is that Russia is not a normal state. It is a pariah state. It is an outlier. It is launched the largest war in Europe since World War II. Largest war, basically. There haven't been wars of this scale in decades, and Russia is more than happy to break norms, to upend the international order, and we are the only ones that are playing by these old rules. We are tying our own hands. I think you could say we shouldn't stoop to Russia's level, but at the same time, we shouldn't bind our options in a way that significantly adversely affects our interests, which is to support Ukraine, to have Russia start paying for this war, to use the fact that we're seizing Russian assets and delivering them to Ukraine as a means to warn off Russia from attacking civilian populations, destroying apartment buildings and things of that nature. I think that's to me that's a very, very, it might not be the easiest trade-off, but it's a viable course of action.
Right. Right. So we dove right into policy and your expertise here. Usually I start with something on the more personal side. So I'd like to back up for a second. The very last line of chapter 2 in your book, Here Right Matters, which, by the way, recommended reading, just incredible, an incredible account of a life, not just your life, but you trace it back. So the last line in chapter 2 of the book, I come from people who had to be braver than I've had to be. Can you tell us about some of those people?
Well, I think you and I may have some things in common in that regard. I was born in what was then the Ukraine Soviet Socialist Republic. Your family, it sounds like, originated from that part of the world also. They beat us, most of them beat us to the US by about 50 years. We came in 79. It sounds like your family may have come over in the 20s. But I think in that period, your ancestors made a valiant decision to leave the Russia and the Soviet Union, the new Soviet Union at that point in time, fearing the pogroms and the anti-Semitism against the Jewish people. And in making that valiant decision way back when, they made their children and eventually your life easier. It is hard to fathom the hardships that my parents and grandparents had to experience. My dad was born in 32. He was, he was in the single digits. He was 9 years old when the war started, and he flew as fled as a refugee to the Ural Mountains. His father died in the war. My mother's father died in the war. The hardships that they had to suffer through, those are hard for us Americans to really understand because we don't have that frame of reference. We don't have that perspective. So I think for me, it was important to recognize that there was both an element of nurture, what I learned in the military, how I was raised by my father, my mother, my stepmother, and nature, something ingrained in my DNA about resilience, about toughness, maybe, fearlessness or something of that nature. And I just wanted to address that by telling the story of my father and his relatives and so forth from that period of time. And I'm pretty darn close with my dad. I talked about him in my testimony in front of Congress. I think it's one of the more notable lines where I kind of try to put his mind at ease, because from his frame of reference, growing up and basically, his adult life was in the Soviet Union. He left when he was 47. You don't protest, you don't call out corruption the way I did with regards to Donald Trump without suffering the most severe consequences.
Yeah.
Being killed, being imprisoned. I lost my career. I could live with that. I'm now on to a new phase, but I needed to kind of address the differences that we have, what makes our country unique, and why here right matters, because the U.S. is different.
In a way, your dad taught you and prepared you your whole life for that moment. One line that seems to sum up his story is, don't just start over, keep starting over, as you said. Can you unpack that for us and how it's especially served you in the last few years?
Yeah, so just quickly on my dad. I mean, he fled at the beginning of World War II. He fled to the Ural Mountains. When he came back, his family was basically dispossessed of their apartment. It was handed over to somebody that the Communist Party wanted to have their apartment. Had to start over there. He was after finishing university, he had to go to Central Asia and basically work there because the Russians were the Soviets were doing a very effective job of like trying to homogenize and shifting populations around. He came to the U.S. at the age of 47. So that's starting over repeatedly. For me, I think it was the fact that in my own background, I think I was a rascal, and I got
I
kicked
love
out of my
those. I love those
yeah.
stories, by the way, of you and Eugene creating obstacle courses all throughout Brighton Beach. Basically
That's right.
not touching sidewalk for like blocks at a time. It was
Yeah.
great.
It was fun. So I mean, studies came easy to me. Like I got pretty good grades, but when it came to university, I was basically off on my own, and I was really badly disciplined. So I got kicked out of my first university. Then I had to start over and finished up my degree successfully at SUNY Binghamton. Received my commission, went on to Harvard, Johns Hopkins, and so forth. But the point is that, like, between my father's experience and my own experience overcoming challenges, like, I learned that you shouldn't fear, you shouldn't be paralyzed. At least you should maybe concerned, but you shouldn't be paralyzed by the unknown or starting over. I recognized that I wouldn't be in the same position as my dad, coming to the U.S. with three sons and a mother-in-law that he didn't get along with, and $750 in his pocket, and starting over. I would have to start a new career, but I had my Ivy League educations and my networks and credibility, doing the right thing, and expertise, policy expertise. So I just didn't let that be the driver of my actions. I was going to pave my own way and not be subject to fears.
Yeah, I really appreciate the way you speak of your dad with such reverence. And you ascribe this enduring sense of integrity to the way he raised you and your brothers. I was curious what his reaction has been to the way
Mhm.
Donald Trump and others in his orbit have spoken about you since the since you came forward?
So my dad voted for Donald Trump in 2016. He was a Trump supporter. It was a gradual um, evolution to kind of step away from that. Um, my dad would, kind of give a report card on Trump. In 2017, 2018, he went from like 92% support to like eventually like 80. It's just, I'm throwing out numbers, but it
Yeah.
was a gradual decline. And then, frankly, when Trump attacked me, when I reported Trump's corruption, my dad was very, very anxious about me reporting it. So it said I should not do that. I should march into the Oval Office and make nice with him and just kind of move on. And I wasn't going to do that. That just, he did it not from the standpoint of being a Trump supporter anymore or anything of that nature. It wasn't that kind of counsel. It was a counsel from living in the Soviet Union and what happens when you challenge authority. At that point, he had already kind of separated from Trump. But after I said I was going to do what I was going to do, and I was attacked for it, in his mind, he couldn't reconcile, the fact that he loved his son and respected me and knew that I was doing the right thing, and somebody was attacking me for doing the right thing.
Yeah.
And that was a big break. And I'd say that for for him, that was a gradual. Now he can't stand him as a liar, as basically like valueless, as in like he doesn't have any values or any ethics. And my dad is really keen on truthfulness and integrity and things of that nature. So the blinders are off. But it was that's not where he started, and it took some time. I mean, in a way, I think it's the story of Donald Trump for lots of Americans.
Yeah.
Now, Donald Trump, I find it impossible that he could win 2024 re-election. It's going to be close because there's two candidates to choose from, but elections are a game of addition. You try to bring people on, you get people to turn out. The only people that are going to turn out for Donald Trump are hardcore MAGA, and he's not going to win independents. So he can't win, but it's been an evolution, I think, across America. But we're still in a danger zone until after November.
Yeah.
After we get through this election.
Yeah, you're talking to the right guy when it comes to trying to prognosticate about those 4 to 7 states that are really going to decide the presidential election. I am concerned. Mike Madrid is a brilliant numbers guy. He's concerned in particular about the leakage the Democratic Party's had in terms of Latino votes and a couple of other voting blocks. But that's another question. I did want to ask you about the perfect call, but I had another question first. You face so much harassment, even death threats to this day. How has it affected Rachel and your daughter, and how have you dealt with it as a family?
Well, that's a probably a better frame than asking me, because I tend to be dismissive. For them, it's for Rachel in particular, it's anxiety inducing. She is gone so far as to say that we might have to leave the country if Trump is reelected. There's no way I'm leaving this country. I'm going to fight him and make sure that he doesn't wreck the country beforehand to prevent him from getting there. And I'll fight him if I need to after. But from her standpoint, she's concerned about our daughter. She's concerned about our safety. According to my daughter, my wife is responsible for safety. I'm responsible for fun. So I think from that standpoint, it is very anxiety producing, to the point where like my wife is turning 50 this year. She doesn't look like it. She looks like she's turning 35. But she's like, oh, do we want to do a big 50th birthday thing? Should we do something small and save money in case things the elections go in Trump's favor? And I'm not gonna. It's her 50th birthday. It's gonna be a bash.
Good.
But in general, that's where she is. My daughter is a little bit different. She's turning 13. Actually, this is her bat mitzvah weekend.
Oh, wow. Mazel tov.
Yeah, thank you. Family coming into from all across the country. Some folks are already here. For her, she didn't understand the initial reaction. As a matter of fact, if anything, I got cool dad points.
Oh,
at the beginning, because she didn't notice, she didn't register the hate. All she saw was Trevor Noah doing a super funny skit about me, or Stephen Colbert doing like nightly shows talking about me. So I was that was cool points. Now she's more sensitive, and she's like, oh, does that person like daddy or not like daddy? And she's probably more political than almost any other 13-year-old
Yeah.
out there, and read in, because that's what our life is. But I think it's there in the back of her mind now, which is, to me, that's troubling. That's another reason why I want to get past Trumpism, MAGA, because then we could get back to some sort of normalcy, and my daughter, could be a kid and not have to worry about these things.
Yeah. If you like this show, you should check out another podcast that I love, Beyond Politics. It's entertaining, informative, and full of conversations with smart people with fresh ideas. Hosted by former U.S. Congressman Paul Hodes and our recent guest, veteran political operative Matt Robeson. They get amazing insiders, authors, analysts as guests. Plus, they have a weekly news discussion show where Republicans and Democrats manage to have real conversations. Kind of like what we're going for here. But they also mean it when they say they go beyond politics. So you'll hear from the leading expert on impeachment one week and the lead project scientist for the James Webb Space Telescope the next. Subscribe to Beyond Politics anywhere you get your podcasts, Apple, Spotify, and all the major apps. And we will be sure to put links to Beyond Politics in the show notes. Yeah, I love your wife's voice on she has such a intelligent, sometimes snarky in a really humorous way. I love the voice that she's crafted for herself. I've obviously never met her, but she does have an important contribution, the stuff that I've read of hers, whether they're posts on social media or lengthier pieces that I've read. So props to you, man. You seem like you have a great family, and congratulations on Bat Mitzvah weekend. That's a lot of fun. So
I mean, there's all that, and then there's the twin. I mean,
yeah.
he's copied my face and everything, and he's out there also running for office.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. So Virginia 7, that's another critical district. So while we're talking about that, tell us about Eugene and his campaign for Virginia. That's Abigail Spanberger's seat, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, first, let me say I endorse Eugene. Well, I mean, so he's a career public servant like I am. He was spent 25 years in uniform, was on the National Security Council with me, was there with me when I right over my shoulder when I testified, was there with me when I reported Trump's corruption. And so that's a good starting point. Ethical, values-based leader. He's also a national security pro, which we need more of those folks in government. We don't need radical extremists, frankly, on the right or the left. As you don't get that many of those in the military. People think about Michael Flynn. He's an egregious aberration. In reality, people in the military kind of figure out how to compromise, get along. So he's center left Democrat, but not a radical by any means. And then, of course, I think he's also keenly focused on challenging MAGA in general, being the anti-Trump candidate, but also running on the merits, running for what's important to the folks in Virginia 7 in Northern Virginia, whether that's traffic and I-5 corridor, infrastructure build-outs, education, investments in the region, all those types of things. He's immigration reform. We're big proponents of comprehensive immigration reform. We're products of the American dream and of coming here as immigrants. So I think he's going to be a huge asset. In a lot of ways, he's probably the only viable. It might hurt some people's feelings in that district, but he's probably the only viable candidate. His opponents are a series of MAGA vet bros, a special forces guy, a SEAL, a Marine, an Army guy. I'm serious. That's four of the candidates right there.
Wow.
And I think those folks for that district are veteran or national security background in that district is important. It's part of that kind of DC suburb with lots of government or public servants and so forth. and he's the only one that really could raise money. He's done a gangbusters on raising. It's interesting that we are okay with paying our elected office holders their salary when they're in government, but sometimes donating to a campaign is kind of a mental block. But if you think about it as you're picking your team,
Yeah.
your donation helps you pick the team that you're then going to pay as long as they're in government. That makes it a little bit easier. So he's done really well with lots of grassroots support, lots of support in the district, far and above beyond anything, any other of the really excellent Democrats there have raised. But on that basis, he's the most viable.
Yeah, and I think there's something to be said for that, because there are so few districts that are truly competitive. You can make an argument that it's only about a dozen out of 435 seats in Congress, and that's one of those districts, as is California 27. And not only that, I think a lot of what actually gets done hinges on center left or center right representatives like that. The biggest pieces of legislation that's gotten done under Biden have been bipartisan pieces of legislation, bipartisan infrastructure, chips, even McCarthy, the last
Inflation
fiscal
reduction,
cliff. Yeah.
Everything.
So it's center left folks like that are really critical to what's going to be happening in these coming months and years. So I did want to ask you about the the perfect call, the infamous call. I'm referring, for those who aren't familiar, if your head's been buried in the sand for about 5 years, it's when Donald Trump tried to extort Vladimir Zelensky to announce an investigation into Biden. So you said that reporting the improper nature of that call wasn't difficult for you. It was clear what your duty was ethically, and your brother in the position that he was, it was so it's
Fortuitous.
yeah, fortuitous. Yeah, I mean, it was sometimes it really affirms my belief in God. Like, God really does have his hand on things sometimes, but that's a whole other part of what we talk about here.
Yeah.
Had there been other calls or conversations that you witnessed or heard in your role as, at that time, Director of European Affairs, that also crossed lines prior to the one with President Zelensky? I can't imagine that the so-called perfect call was the first one that crossed lines.
There were a number of phone calls like that. The difference is that there were a number of other directors, and it fell in their portfolio. And in my case, theirs were probably more gray area. The fact that Trump allowed himself to be manipulated by the president of Turkey, Erdogan, into withdrawing all U.S. Troops in Syria. That was the event that precipitated Jim Mattis, the Secretary of Defense, to resign, if you recall.
Yeah.
That was far from a perfect call. The way that Trump interacted with, and I'm not saying anything that is not in the public record already. The way that Trump interacted with the Saudis after the murder of Khashoggi, the Washington Post reporter, far from a perfect call. The difference from mine and theirs, a lot of those stayed in the foreign policy channel, what might more clearly be in the president's lane to develop, or not even develop, to implement foreign policy. The Constitution gives him the powers to do that. What the Constitution doesn't give him the powers to do is to steal an election. In my case, it wasn't just a foreign policy issue. It wasn't, if it was just a foreign policy issue, that'd be one thing. But what he tried to do is he tried to extort Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, to produce an investigation into Biden at the time when Biden looked very, very vulnerable, and in so doing, harm or tip the scales in Trump's favor for a 2020 election. If he was successful, if I hadn't reported that phone call, I mean, the fact is that he would have gotten away with it. He would have orchestrated he would have probably compelled Zelensky to deliver this investigation. As a matter of fact, there is a fair bit of reporting to suggest that Zelensky was about 3 days away from announcing an investigation in order to lift $400 million in aid to Ukraine. Zelensky held out for months. He held out for until really the 11th hour, where the money was about to go
Wow.
disappear. And ultimately, he was pressured. His
Wow.
country was at war. He was pressured into doing it. But if I hadn't reported it, this would have happened. And you could see a scenario in which Trump would have then cast Biden as equally corrupt. This was what months before Biden took off in the South Carolina primary, and he may have not made it. Made it through the primary. He may have not been the nominee, and then we would see Trump facing off against potentially a less viable general election candidate. It could have been Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren, and we could have ended up with a second Trump administration. So, I mean, did I know that at the time? No, I just reported within classified channels behind closed doors that what Trump did was wrong, and he needed to, and I thought was criminal, and he needed to reverse course to not expose himself to some sort of criminal indictment. That was my report behind closed doors, but that also set off a chain of events that ultimately resulted
Yeah.
in congressional oversight and impeachment. And all I do, yeah, by testifying is following through on those reports.
So, since you bring it up, we're facing the possibility again of a second Trump term, and you have a more informed perspective on this than many, many others. Can you tell us what the risks the U.S. would be taking if Trump were to be elected again, and in what ways would it be different from the first term?
Yeah. So I think the second term for Donald Trump would be unhinged.
Mm.
If the first term at least started with adults in the room, Jim Mattis, John Kelly, a bunch of different folks that were in position, Rex Tillerson, like him or not, these were, kind of somewhat professional, guided by some, by principles and so forth. It devolved later on. Uh, this second administration would start without any of those adults. It would be with sycophants. It would be with henchmen. It would be with basically a group it would never say no to him and carry out whatever his crazy ideas are without questioning them whatsoever.
Yeah.
So on that basis, it's very dangerous. I think the way we would be perceived around the world, it's hard to say when you're talking about states which are enduring, survive for hundreds of years, typically, maybe in some cases thousands, but no, in modern era, at least hundreds of years. So you can't say we would forever harm our reputation, but for the foreseeable future, for generations, we would be seen as an unreliable partner. We'd be seen not as the shining city on the hill, the effort to create a more perfect union and democracy, the bastion of democracy. We would be seen as one of a number of failing democracies, failed states, and we would probably turn the world into a much, much more dangerous place under a Trump administration, because we would basically see a return to the rules of the jungle,
Mm.
where the strong prey on the weak, and where violence reigns. And I think that we would probably be setting conditions for a bigger, much, much bigger confrontation between East and West, between authoritarians and democracies. And then, that's the big picture. That's kind of geopolitics.
Yeah.
Domestically, it's hard to say whether our institutions can survive a second 4 years. I think they did survive, clearly, the first 4 years. We had public servants that were holding the line. That was not just me. That was all those other folks that testified alongside of me, talking about Trump corruption. And then you had, then at the very end, you had Trump saying, you know what, this is a problem. And he was actually going to fire public servants in mass and put in loyalists without any competency whatsoever. The only criteria is loyalty, fealty to Trump. And I think that's a hard thing for our institutions to be able to bear. You would see that in law enforcement. You would see that in the courts. You would see that in defense. You'd see that in the intelligence services. An unwinding of norms, an unwinding of rules, an unwinding of kind of order, and chaos would start to reign.
Yeah. Yeah. Well,
Sorry to scare you.
well, I'm planning a solo episode where I just share some thoughts and start to organize some thoughts around it's going to be okay. Even if it's not okay, it's going to be okay. But it's getting harder and harder to say that it's going to be okay if certain dominoes fall. So you provided a great context, kind of globally, domestically. One of the other ways that I like to think about this is whether you want to think of it as kitchen table or coffee shop conversations, over a beer type conversations. I do make a point of maintaining friendships across differences, including some friends who still strongly support Trump. Some of the conversations I've had have been absolutely confounding and frustrating. For example, someone we were talking about Ukraine, and he said, "Oh, he'd be able to negotiate a deal in a day." Or Israel, yeah, exactly. For those who aren't watching, there was definitely an eye roll there. I know an eye roll. You have a
What my
teenager
daughter
now.
would describe as a bombastic eye roll.
Bombastic eye roll. The one that was really hard to deal with, I had to cut off this conversation. Sometimes I have to know my limitations and what's really upsetting. I have cousins in Israel, so some of our family came here, some of our family ended up in Israel, and that if Trump wasn't in office, Hamas never would have attacked in the first place. So yeah, exactly. So again, another bombastic eye roll. You have a more informed view than any of my friends who are,
Yeah.
spewing the talking points. How would you respond to such assertions?
Well, so I would first say that I think if we didn't, it's because of Trump that we've had some of our most challenging, we face the challenges that we face today. If you think about Afghanistan, it was Trump's deal to withdraw Afghanistan. As a matter of fact, Biden delayed it, but then faced the reality that it would be an explosion in violence if he didn't follow through on Trump's deal. And maybe that the withdrawal itself could have been handled better. That's true, but it was Trump's deal that was being implemented. Ukraine. The reason that Ukraine happened was most importantly because Trump thought it was. I mean, Putin thought it was an opportunity. Putin felt that this was the moment to strike. He tried it in 2014 to subdue Ukraine. Turns out that Ukraine cauterized that wound and continued to march forward. Uh, uh, European integration, building out a military, building a prosperous economy, and his window for actually taking action against Ukraine was diminishing. And what he sensed in 2022 was a U.S. that was in seemingly in disarray. The planning for this and the staging for this war in 2022 actually started in 2021. You don't just flip a switch. You have to build up all of the resources, all the tanks and artillery and everything else. You have to put in fuel, hospitals, and everything else. That actually started in March of 21. What's interesting about March 21? It's weeks after January 6th, where the U.S. looked basically on the brink of failure,
Right.
where Trump almost successfully stole the presidency. And then over the course of those subsequent months, as he was reading the tea leaves of action or inaction, he certainly didn't perceive, the kinds of forceful responses that he needed from Biden. Although Biden did offer stern warnings and started to provide additional support for Ukraine, but what Putin most noticed is that Trump captured Republican Party was not going to take action to hold Putin accountable for this war. That was the pronouncements from Trump saying that Russia is the good guy, Ukraine is the bad guy, filled with Nazis and corrupt. Tucker Carlson, Mike Pompeo, days before, Ron Johnson, all these folks were cheerleading for Russia. So in Russia's calculation, when you do the cost benefit, Ukraine seemed like an easy prize. They thought they could, they huge chauvinists, believing in Russian exceptionalism and in the backwoods Ukrainians not being able to stand up. So they thought the military portion was going to be easy, but the political fallout is what they were most concerned about. What would the West do? And the indications from the Republican Party, from Trump captured Republican Party, was nothing. Potentially a pat on the back. Trump said after Russia invaded, Putin is a smart guy. That's what he was. That's what Putin was counting on.
Yeah.
So this nonsense about Trump not being there, he would have zero question that Putin would have executed the snatch and grab on Ukraine at some point during a second Trump administration. If he were to win in 2020, he probably would have just waited maybe another 6 months until NATO completely fell apart, because that's something that Trump wants to do, withdraw from NATO.
Yeah.
He would have waited until there was more chaos and disarray and exploited that. So this nonsense that it wouldn't have happened under Trump is just bull, first of all. And second of all, it is just the height of ignorance and folly for Trump to claim that he could end this in a day. He's a laughing stock to Putin. Putin thinks he's a joke, easily manipulated. So there's no lever that he has over Putin. One, and the biggest prize for Putin is to subdue the entirety of Ukraine, to show that the West is weak, and then to potentially chip away and destroy NATO. So then that's the biggest country in the region and can prey on the smaller countries, rebuilding the Soviet or frankly the Russian Empire. So that's no leverage there, and the Ukrainians wouldn't bend. I mean, right now the Ukrainians are actually doing on making do on their own. They haven't gotten any real aid from the U.S. since the end of September. We were giving them budgetary support to be able to cover their expenses. That stopped. So really for months now, they've been doing on their own, and all the security assistance is stopped also. My contacts and relationships in the defense sectors have told me that they've been told to shut off anything to do with Ukraine. There is no money left.
Yeah.
So what leverage would he have on Ukraine? None. The Ukrainians, it would just be a bloody mess. The Ukrainians would keep fighting. The Europeans would be there in their corner. Maybe the Europeans would even actually, this is not speculation. I do conferences in Europe. I speak to policymakers. There is a good chance that you have the Baltic states, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia. You have Poland that feel the dangers from Russia acutely. Potentially, they actually put troops in Ukraine to bolster Ukraine, because they'd rather fight on Ukrainian territory than their own. And that is a recipe for to catalyze this into already the largest war in the world, if you think about it by landmass, Russia, Ukraine, into something even bigger, into something that's approaching world scale,
Right.
world war. And that is what you would have with Donald Trump. You would have chaos and catastrophe.
Yeah. So I'm curious if you have friends. I would imagine that you have friends from your long military career that are still supportive of Trump. Do you stay in touch with them? And if so, are you able to have conversations with folks that really disagree with you on these issues?
These are not conversations you have in the military. The
Mm,
military is apolitical. Nobody had any idea whether I was a Democrat or Republican. I don't know what the party affiliations are of my fellow military members were, the ones especially that are serving. It just doesn't come up. There's not a thought task. Oh, are you voting for Biden or Trump? So these are actually just simply not conversations that occur. Now, after people leave the military, things become a little bit clearer, and there are people on both sides of the aisle. I would say that based on how aggressively I fight Trumpism, and MAGA, these are probably the people that don't want to. I mean, if they were friends, they're not my friends anymore, because in a lot of ways, I'm the face of the
yeah.
enemy.
Right.
It's not like it's just one citizen talking to another. But what I find interesting is when people don't know who I am, like man on the street, I could have conversations with just about anybody. I mean, I remember coming back from my wife's family's in Oklahoma, driving back to, this is just one anecdote of many, getting stuck on Highway 81 in like Western Virginia, and like parking lot, nothing moving. And there was a good old boy, just across the way from Western Virginia, that was in front of me. And he got out, he had some water in a cooler. He's like, hey, it was summer. He's like, hey, and we started chatting. We started chatting about all sorts of different things. We started talking about politics even. We started talking about what was going on with Biden versus Trump, and like all the stuff about like the that Trump is better on the economy or defense. And I just, I was asking questions like, what is it that you liked about him? It was like, oh, he's good for the economy. He's like, well, are you tracking that the lowest unemployment numbers in 60 years are under Biden? Are you tracking that our economy is growing, last quarter at 5%? That was a different talking point back then.
Yeah.
Or that, that Trump called fallen military suckers and losers, and just point by point kind of diving into these well, I think he's different. He shakes things up. Roots out the swamp. I was like, okay, are you familiar with these episodes of corruption? And you could have those conversations. Actually, I now live in South Florida, and even folks that know who I am, I could have civil conversations with them about different things. They're curious about what it's like to work in the White House, what it's like to work in the Trump White House, and I share my firsthand accounts and stuff like that. You could have those conversations. It's just not something that you do in the military because it's so kind of alien to have conversations about politics in the military.
That's a good clarification. I appreciate that. Yeah, no, it makes sense, and I think you're right. I think that most folks are open to having the conversation, and this is the work that we do. We're trying to figure out how to do it better because a lot of folks might just, to your point, know one thing about you, remember seeing your face on one news report depending on which news channel they're watching, think they know everything that they need to know about you, as opposed to diving in and learning about you as a human being, learning about your story. And then if we see each other that way, then we're better able to have these conversations. Folks are more open to, new information, especially if you're open to like, well, what's your story and what's your experience and why do you feel that way? Yeah.
I enjoy talking to people, frankly. Sometimes it could be taxing, but in general, I enjoy talking to people and hearing their perspectives and stuff like that. And maybe my best asset is like my daughter, who's super, super charming, 13-year-old. And like, even if they think that like I'm a jerk or something like that, they're spending time around her and they're like, well, you can't be all that bad.
That's awesome. Well, you know what? You know what you could do? You could tell them what was the thing I read? I was reading about, and I laughed out loud. Oh, Operation Cabbage Patch. Tell them about Operation Cabbage Patch, and you'll have them dying laughing.
Well,
So,
I've had setbacks. I learned a lot, as much from my setbacks as I did from my successes. I
yeah,
talked about academics. Like I flunked out of the first university. I had a free ride.
yeah.
I flunked out because I just didn't do the work, and then had to claw my way back. And now I could talk about it without being as embarrassed. It's still embarrassing, but as embarrassed because I've proven myself there.
Yeah.
But in the military too, as a brand new second lieutenant, you make mistakes. Like in this particular Operation Cabbage Patch, it was in my first assignment in Korea. The conditions are very, very different. It's rice paddies. Everything is kind of like, wet and muddy
Marshy and
and
yeah.
marshy, and everything kind of sinks in. And I was doing a reconnaissance patrol with my driver, and young guy, probably not the strongest soldier, but sometimes what you do is, because you want to develop folks, you take those folks. You don't always put the best with you. You want those folks leading other soldiers. So I had a driver that wasn't one of the best, and I kept a close eye on him. And on this one occasion, he's like, "I've got this, sir. This is all good.
Yeah.
I could drive down this road." And ultimately, what ended up happening is that we rolled this Humvee into mud, and luckily nobody got hurt. I was able to yank somebody that was in the turret into the vehicle, so we rolled over. And then it was a hours long effort to get this vehicle out, using all sorts of like resources that are nowhere to be, that are hard to come by. They had to get like one of these 18 wheelers to try to get me out, and then that didn't work because this thing was like buried in the mud. Then they got something that lifts out 50-ton tanks, and they got that in there, but there was no traction. So then they got a second one of those to anchor the first one to be able to haul me out. And
Oh man.
anyway, it was a learning experience. It was embarrassing. They got it out. Nobody got hurt. I learned from that to
Yeah.
trust but verify. And That's the way you learn. You learn
Trust but
from your
verify.
failures. Yeah.
That's great. That's great. Yeah, but it is true. You learn a lot more from the L's than you do from the W's. So
Yeah.
I really that was a great story. But I did want to ask you what I call the TP&R question for talking politics and religion without killing each other. What do you think each of us can do to be able to share space with, have better conversations with, perhaps even nurture relationships with people across our differences? So, and you've already been describing some of this, people who think differently than we do, have different beliefs or life experiences than we do, who get their news from different sources than we do. How can we do better at talking politics and religion without killing each other? Or is it even possible?
It's possible.
Good.
It's possible. It could be frustrating, but it's possible. I'd start. I would start with local. Talk about people's communities. Uh, people are proud of their communities by and large. I mean, there are some places probably we don't know those people that live in really really tough communities that 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 are different kinds of conversations. But the folks that are in our lives, they're proud of their communities. They're proud of their neighbors. They're proud of their home. So talk to them about how things are going in their communities. And guess what? They're almost invariably like all the catastrophes are occurring over there in that next town over in that next community. That's what the news is talking about. It's not my community. We're living great. Everything is going well. I mean, yeah, things could be better, but it's the next town over. We don't want to end up like them if we don't take the proper steps. So you start with community and ask people to take a look around their community, and then you say, do you really think that that next town over is like that? Do you think that's the way people live, or you think that's just what the news focuses on because that's what the news does? They're penny dreadful, is trying to scare people for clicks and stuff like that. And people will start to think about that. They'll be like, wait, I'm doing okay. Could I be doing better? Yes, things are more expensive, but salaries are increasing. Investments are improving, and I think you just ask people to believe their eyes. The other thing I think is helpful is people are proud of their families and like to talk about their families, and I think that's a way you find some common ground. About what how our kids are doing and things of that nature, and you start from the point of commonality, maybe before you dive into the thorny issues like Trump turning our country into a authoritarian regime and destroying our democracy. You
Yeah.
do that as a second talk.
Yeah. Follow that up. Maybe in the second conversation. I did want to
Well,
ask you.
second part of the first conversation.
Yeah, perhaps. I remember I had a mentor once who taught me this thing called form, FORM. He was teaching me sales. So he's a sales guy. So the M was for message, but I've used the first three just for conversation starter, relationship building, family, occupation, recreation, message. So I use family, occupation, recreation whenever, just to ask somebody, hey, family around here? Did you grow up around here? Occupation? What do you do for a living? And just kind of go through family, occupation, and recreation. And next thing you know, you're into a great conversation with somebody. There was something important that I did want to ask you before we start to wrap up. You said that what happened in the immediate aftermath of the call, not just what happened to you, but your brother, the rest of your family was what everybody was subjected to, that your faith in this country was shaken. And this is the country that you served and loved your entire adult life. How is your faith in our country and its institutions now?
Shaken is, I think that's an accurate way to describe it, but it's still pretty firm actually. It's shaken is in that, maybe some of the naivete is kind of is gone, and that there are people that, are okay, frankly, burning it all down just to get even with somebody that they think is, doing better than them or looks down on them. That's what it is grievances. So we have people like that, and I can't really stand those people. Those are not people I want to have conversations with.
Yeah.
I want to have conversations with people that don't that may have issues and concerns, but are not prepared to burn it all down just to get even. So I would say shaken, but still firm, still holding. I still think this country is getting ready to turn a corner. Trump is going to be too old to run for anything after 2024. And I think that, frankly, he's likely to go to jail. So I think we'll come through, and then people will be embarrassed for supporting MAGA and Trump, and we'll have one of those kind of revelations. But in general, I think I do love this country and appreciate it. We do tend to move forward. The arc of progress shifts towards a more perfect union, in my view, to borrow that famous phrase. And I think that we tend to take a step back when we make progress. So it's because we've made so much progress, because we're more inclusive, that there are more opportunities for more Americans, that there's such a wave of resistance, a regressive wave of resistance that's taking us back, because people are trying to hang on and maintain their edge. But again, it's because of the progress, and that's the way I see it.
That's interesting. You made me think of a theological premise of tikkun olam, that the process of making the world better, that God is in the process, whether you look at it from a Christian perspective or a Jewish perspective. This story is a redemption project. So I don't want to confuse America with religious things, Bible things, but among our neighbors, among our countrymen, we can do this as Americans too. Keeping those things distinct. So it is gray area to start blurring the lines, and a lot of my friends from church have crossed that line in the wrong way. So I don't want to go too far down that path. But do you have any questions for me?
I do, actually.
Oh,
I was curious. I was curious about how you handle the topic of religion. We spent a lot of time talking about politics and
yeah.
policy. The topic of religion is pretty fraught right now, because I think it's also caught up in the politics. It's caught up in this in this notion of identity, and Christian fundamentalism, aligned with MAGA, which seems like it would be at odds, because the tenets of Christianity and Judaism would prescribe the opposite of the direction that Trump is taking this country. So how do you, I would be curious to hear about how you talk about religion.
Yeah. So we've covered a lot of ground, a lot of, as a Christian, I've ended up speaking with a lot of prominent Christian leaders, but in particular, prominent Christian leaders who know that there's a cancer. Whether you want to call it, like Tim Alberto wrote this book, The Kingdom, the Power, and the Glory, American Evangelicals in an Age of Extremism. Robbie Jones of PRRI wrote a book about basically how on racism. Dr. Russell Moore, he's now with Christianity Today. He used to be with the SBC, the Southern Baptist Convention on the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, has also addressed this problem. One of the things that gives me a lot of hope is I just spoke to Curtis Chang, who has partnered with David French, Dr. Moore, to start what they call the after party. And it is a way to equip churches with how to diagnose this, name this problem, this disease that affects, in particular, white evangelical American churches, how to name it, but also how to do better, how to be like that group of Jewish, like rabbi. Jesus was a Jew. He was like a rabbi with some students, and they were working it out, and to be more like that, where Rabbi Jesus had Matthew the tax collector and Simon the zealot in particular. Like, talk about, like, they make Republicans and Democrats look like friends, zealots compared to tax collectors. So he was able to do it. So I talk about it in a way. I want to be earnest about naming the problem, right? I also want to be open, like an open hand, if you will, to those who really strongly disagree with me, to be able to have these conversations and meet that person where they're at, right? So if it's a brother from church who feels really strongly, say, about immigration, I'll say, all right, dude, let's talk about it. Like, let's talk about it. But if you believe in the Bible, let's open the Bible, see what the Bible has to say about it. And let's see, like, are you in line with what the Bible's saying about it? And if not, let's just own it. It's okay, but let's just own it. but here's what the Bible's saying about it, you know? So that's one of the ways, but the biggest way that I deal with it is, I try to be pluralistic. So I try to have rabbi friends come on, atheist friends who've come on, you know, so, or a Buddhist and Hindu friends that have come on. So I do try to be pluralist, like our country is, right? But I also try to learn how to do it better, as opposed to getting into contests with people, which is the default posture so many folks come into these conversations with. I'm going to get into a debate with you. I'm going to get into a contest with you, and I'm going to win. My side's going to win. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in relationships. I'm interested in human beings. So I'm going to try to do my best. Now, sometimes there's a line, like when that guy said that my friend said, I still haven't spoken to him. I just need more time so that I'm not going to him just completely pissed off. He was talking about Israel. Like, dude, one of my cousin's nephew was still missing. It turns out he died tragically on October 7th. Like, I'm not going to talk to you about this, man. You know, so I have to know my limitations. But most of the time I'm able to approach a conversation with the goal of nurturing a relationship and with the posture of leaving room for the possibility that at some point I might say, I never thought of it that way, with the hopes that they would too. And I think that is the best medicine, the best antibodies that we can introduce into the system that fights back against, like you've talked a lot about propagandizing, how so many people have been propagandized. I think those are the antibodies. But anyway, it's an interesting way to ask a question because, well, you can see it got me going.
Yeah. So maybe I should be doing this. I don't know.
You're talking my language now, man. I'm telling you. You would be an absolute natural. So let's geek out about that sometime. But before we close up, how can folks follow you, find more information about all the great work that you're doing on Substack, find out about any books that are coming out, and just all the great work that you're doing?
So I run a think tank. I do a lot of policy work. I think, frankly, what people would find in my Substack is that actually it's not all that dissimilar than the advice I give to actual congressmen, senators, the White House. So that's a good thing to understand. I think the American public should know what the good ideas are around different geopolitical challenges. I do have a book coming out. It's not available yet. It'll be coming out through Hachette and Public Affairs. It's my doctoral dissertation on U.S. policy towards Russia and Ukraine since 1991. It's basically the backstory of how we got to the war. And I think what people would appreciate is the prescription, is that we let things slide for too long with regards to an increasingly aggressive Russia. And we did that because we wanted something from them, but short term. We wanted to work with them on arms control. We wanted to work with them in these smaller areas when we should have been focused on long-term big picture, stability, security. So it's a values-based approach to foreign policy, the centrality of values to interests. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Threads. I'm actually been doing more stuff on something called Post News. I kind of like the platform. It's an Israeli guy that is the CEO. You could do long form stuff there, so it's a cool platform. I think that covers it, and then a lot of philanthropy and a bunch of other stuff.
Great, and we'll be sure to put plenty of the proper links in our show notes, so it's really easy to find you. Before we close, is there anything, we covered a lot of ground today, but is there anything important that we left out that you want to add before we close?
I would say, I think we did cover a lot of ground. This is an excellent conversation. Looking forward to joining you in the future. I think your conversation about religion is something that my wife Rachel is really interested in. She's read a lot of books in this space and interviewed folks for her podcast that speaks to suburban women. So that's probably something that you guys might geek out about.
Yeah, no. So in all sincerity, I would love to have Rachel on this show. She's somebody that I've been following now for a year or so. And the more what's that?
She's a big, I don't know. I'll talk to her. She's a big get. I'm not sure if we could, if we can be able to.
I've heard her on a couple. She only picks like very, very top notch. So I don't know if I qualify, but man, that would be such a treat.
I mean, I will talk to her, but I can't guarantee that's going to carry much water.
Totally understand. Alex, this has been such a treat, man. And there's so much more that we could talk. We didn't even really talk about Brooklyn and where my family's from in Ukraine. So there's so much more to talk about. But what a treat it was to talk to you today. Thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And as always, if you dig what we're doing here, remember to subscribe or follow, depending on your app, and write that review. It really does make a difference. And tell a friend about us. Tell a friend about it. Talk politics and religion without killing each other. Really easy to recommend. It's politicsandreligion.us. It's www.politicsandreligion.us. Or you can find me online at Corey S. Nathan, at Corey S as in Sam, Nathan, at Corey S. Nathan. And I'm on a bunch of threads and Instagram and Facebook, and LinkedIn is a big one for me. Now, go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect, and have a great week.